Good afternoon, and welcome to this extraordinary panel discussion, Russia's war in Ukraine, what's at stake, and what we should do about it. My name is Michael Keller. I'm the university librarian. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this new room, relatively new room, in Hobach Hall. Let me introduce the panelists. They will continue on their own. There will be Q&A moderated by Rose Gottemoeller at the end. So first, my friend Kristjan Prikk, Estonia's ambassador to the US. He started his mission here in Washington in May 2021. He's a graduate of the USA Army War College and has served as the National Security Coordinator to the Prime Minister of Estonia. Prior to arriving in DC, he was the permanent secretary of the Estonian Ministry of Defense. Among his previous assignments are 2 other tours in Washington as an Estonian diplomat and work on NATO-Russia and NATO-Ukraine topics at a time when these relationships were considerably less challenging than today. Rose Gottemoeller is the Stephen C. Hazy Lecturer at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and its Center for International Security and Cooperation. Both of those organizations, by the way, co-sponsoring with us this panel discussion. Before joining Stanford, Gottemoeller was the Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2016 to 2019, where she helped to drive forward NATO's adaptation to new security challenges in Europe and in the fight against terrorism. Prior to NATO, she served for nearly 5 years as the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security at the U.S. Department of State, advising the Secretary of State on arms control, non-proliferation, and political military affairs. To my far left is Stephen Pifer. He's an affiliate of the Center for International Security and Cooperation, as well as a non-resident senior fellow with the Brookings Institution. He was a William J. Perry Fellow at the Center from 2018 to 2022, and a fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin from January to May 2021. Pifer's research focuses on nuclear arms control, Ukraine, Russia, and European security. A retired Foreign Service officer, Pifer's more than 25 years with the State Department focused on U.S. relations with the former Soviet Union and Europe, as well as arms control and security issues, and included service as the 3rd U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Gentlemen and Rose, have at it.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank the Stanford Libraries for giving this opportunity today. I'm certainly beyond humbled to sit between 2 legends of international security policy and particularly when it comes to matters related to transatlantic security, Ukraine and Russia. It's a pity that the reason why we are sitting here is because the security situation in Europe, and I would say certainly beyond Europe, is the worst in decades. Probably there are no security policymakers who have not said that the security situation is particularly dire at any given moment, but I guess this moment is really stands out from anything that anyone in this room has experienced during our lifetimes. And I'm afraid that the situation is likely to get even tenser and worse before it starts to get better. Now, Estonia has been very actively supporting Ukraine during this, not only during this stage of the war that started on 24th of February this year, but actually we have considered Ukraine as the key nation in the wider Central Eastern Europe since we regained independence in the 1990s, and particularly since Crimea and Donbass happened in 2014, we stepped up our efforts to support Ukraine. Now the tragedy that we see unrolling day in and day out in Ukraine right now, in our view, is not a result of some communication failure or a tragic temporary misunderstanding, but rather of a result of a Russian strategic gamble that's been a long time in the making. Now, Russia, since the end of Cold War, has been playing quite well its cards, even though relying mainly on things that are legacy of the Soviet Union, like the permanent seat of in the UN Security Council, as well as the military that it inherited, and particularly the nuclear component of it, as well as the God-given natural resources, of course. This, I would argue, has still not made it possible to be a global shaper, and increasingly Russian leadership has acknowledged that. But they've been playing the role of global spoiler. Now, as President Putin has been increasingly aware of the weakening hand of Russia, and he has been seemingly obsessed by the past history of Russian imperial expansionism. So he has made, and his government has made, both economic as well as military practical steps to ready Russia for a major war. Certainly since the late 2000s, some steps can be traced back even further. Additionally, he and his state-curated media has moved from ridiculing the neighboring nations or ridiculing the neighboring nations as inept. They have moved to questioning their national identity and even the right to exist. And this is certainly the most manifested in the case of Russia. This trajectory of attitude to them as smaller brothers, sometimes as inept or unqualified to run their own country, to denying the identity or reason and right to exist of this nation. Now the immediate impact of the war is certainly felt most by the Ukrainians, and we all know this is horrible. We are talking about tens of thousands of casualties. We're talking about 10 million people living without power. We talk about millions of people living as refugees, and the list goes on and on. But the effects of this particular conflict, as we see it, are certainly wider than only related to Ukraine, and the consequences are global. As much as the Russian leadership may be obsessed about Ukraine and its role in the Russian sphere of influence, so to say, the stakes are much higher. It's not only a military conflict about Ukraine, but it's actually the Russian attack on the democratic Western values that they fear and despise, because they represent the alternative to the tyranny and repressions that their own worldview foresees or supports. So in a way, it certainly is an European war. However, we believe very strongly that the U.S. global interest, vital interest, are clearly also in play in the case of this conflict. So the Western response and the outcome to this war will become the benchmark of what's acceptable, what are the rules of the game, and how the other countries with aspirations beyond their own borders and means to wage war against their neighbors will do after that. This conflict, as we see it, will define the rules of the game, certainly in Europe, but again, we believe even beyond Europe, for at least the decades to come. So, what to do with it? On the one hand, I can only say that what the U.S. administration has done to put together a strong coalition of like-minded countries and also garner the support of American people to understand the nature of this conflict and to support people in the faraway place that we know little, to use the historic term. So this has been just admirable, and I think anyone in this room, including myself, would not have believed a year ago that neither this conflict nor that kind of robust response would have been possible. But we do believe that in order to get it right, it is time to take the Ukrainian assistance up a notch or switch gears. We have to understand that simply the Ukrainian ability to resist the aggression is not enough. We need Ukraine to emerge victorious from this war in Ukraine. If Russia ends up getting anything beyond what they have historically or legally, in terms of international relations, legally entitled to have as a result of this conflict, the lesson for them is clear, that the aggression pays off. So even though we have to acknowledge the risks, we cannot be reckless in our behavior, but we have to be self-confident and bold in supporting Ukraine, militarily, politically, economically, in pressuring further Russia with sanctions, with political sanctions, with economic sanctions, and so on, and with making sure that Russia gets the signal that the crime of aggression cannot go unpunished. So I would stop with that, and certainly I'm very much interested in Rose, your comments, and Steve, yours, and would be ready to answer to any questions the audience may have.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and thank you for a very succinct beginning. We were each asked to speak for a rather limited time, so in 5 minutes I'll do my best to put two sets of issues on the table and then turn to Steve Pifer, and then we'll be opening up for further discussion. So I wanted to concentrate in two areas. First, NATO's role in the current crisis and how it has been reacting. Clearly, President Biden and also the NATO leadership across the alliance has been keen to ensure that this war in Ukraine, despicable and terrible as it is, but does not spill over into a general European war and perhaps into a global conflict. And so that has been the kind of strategic objective of NATO throughout. But that said, my view is that NATO has nevertheless responded in a very full way to Russian aggression. And Ambassador, you stated it exactly right when you said this stage of the war, which started on February 24th, 2022, but the war started long ago, and sincerely, I believe that if we had focused our minds a little more in 2014 when they invaded Crimea, we might not be in the place we are today. Perhaps that's something we can take up in the discussion. But NATO itself began to react strongly in 2014, promising to put more money into defense with the 2% of GDP promise that was agreed at Wales, also promising to begin to bolster reinforcement of Europe. That has only gone at a much more rapid pace in the years since then, but also putting in place, after the Warsaw Summit in 2016, the so-called battle groups in Estonia, in Lithuania, in Latvia, in Poland, and now also after the invasion of the 24th of February in the southwest of Europe as well, in Romania and Bulgaria. These are important, these battle groups, although they are small in number, but they actually bring units from across NATO to essentially the NATO front lines in order to convey a clear signal to the Russian Federation that if they attack NATO territory, they are attacking all of NATO. And so I think that has been a very important military reaction. But the other point I wanted to make, two actually really quick points, is believe it or not, as Deputy Secretary General, I saw the pressure that President Trump put on NATO to invest more in defense paid off, and it has paid off now in the current conflict, because not only have NATO stocks of weaponry, they're not sufficient, and we see that in the news every day, but nevertheless NATO has been steadily investing so that equipment, armaments, weaponry, ammunition are all flowing more now in a way that they would not have been if that pressure had not come during the Trump administration to up expenditure to fulfill the 2% of GDP promises that the NATO leaders made back in Wales in 2014. So I do think that that has benefited the Ukrainians now, as NATO has been better equipped to ship military assistance into Ukraine during this conflict. The second thing I will say, and I pay great compliments to my Canadian colleagues, the amount of NATO training that went on after 2014 of the Ukrainian armed forces has truly paid off in the current conflict. It is clear to me that the Ukrainian armed forces, they have performed in superlative ways in this conflict, but they would not have been nearly as ready for this fight if it had not been for the NATO training that occurred after 2014. So those are some ways I believe that NATO has been both preparing better for its own defense as well as deterrence of Russia, but also assisting the Ukrainians in the current fight with this overarching strategic objective, of course, and again, some debate it, but I believe it's very important for NATO to deter Russia from a larger war between NATO and the Russian Federation. So that's point number one. Point number two is with regard to keeping the nuclear temperature down. I've been very concerned from the outset about Russian nuclear saber-rattling, Putin's nuclear saber-rattling. Again, this is not new. It started back in 2014, around the time of Crimea. That's another place where I think we could have been more acutely aware of the signals that were coming out of Moscow and paying better attention to be, well, perhaps turning the tide in a different direction back at that phase rather than now. But we have come to a point, I think Steve can comment on this, where it does seem that the nuclear rhetoric is abating a bit on the Russian side. He just published a very interesting piece on that. But the other thing that is happening is that we are seeing some, I fear, potentially, well, destabilizing activities occurring. And I'm referring to the attack in the last 2 days on the bomber base at Engels. And I am concerned that there is a potential here for escalation just based on the doctrinal picture we have from Russia. Russian nuclear doctrine points to attacks on strategic targets as implicating nuclear doctrine and perhaps a nuclear response. So I do worry that actions that the Ukrainians are allegedly taking to strike back at military targets that are striking at their civilian infrastructure, nevertheless can have some implications and cause some complications for, as I put it, keeping the nuclear temperature down, because I do think that that is all important also in this current conflict. So I will be interested what views there are in this audience on that matter. It's an important point, and I have been constantly stressing the necessity of trying, despite this terrible war in Ukraine and the despicable actions of the Russian Federation, that we should nevertheless be trying to work with them in the diplomatic arena to keep the nuclear temperature down and to begin to try to work in a more positive way to further constrain nuclear weapons. But at the moment, it doesn't look so good, but I will keep and continue to keep pressing that important message. So with that, let me turn over to Steve Pifer for his remarks, and then we'll open up for discussion.
Well, let me just pick up briefly on the nuclear question, because I do believe if you look at the Russian rhetoric over the last 6 or 7 weeks, going back to really when Putin addressed the Valdai Discussion Club at the end of October, they have tried to lower the rhetoric. And I think it results from 3 factors. One is the nuclear threats were not having any impact on Ukrainians. They were just as determined to defend their country, understandably. Second, they were getting a pretty consistent message from the West that there would be severe consequences. But third, and I think the new factor was you had the Chinese and the Indians come out against it. And I think Putin saw nuclear use as potentially costing Russia the global south. So I think they've backed off, and I hope that continues. I was going to talk a little bit about U.S. interests, which we touched on briefly. You know, why do we care about Ukraine? It's 6,000 miles away. I mean, I spent 3 years there, so I perhaps care the most, but why should it be a big foreign policy issue for the United States? And let me give you 3 basic reasons. One, going back now for 70 years, the United States has had a strong, vital interest in a secure and stable Europe. And that's an economic interest, it's a political interest, it's a security interest. And so if Ukraine prevails, that's going to be good for a stable and secure Europe. If Russia wins, we're going to have a very unstable Europe. And I agree that while people focus now on Russia, I think the big strategic challenge for the United States in the next 3 decades is China. If we don't get Europe right, though, Washington's going to find that it has fewer resources, less military power, and less of that valuable commodity senior level time to devote to China, because it's going to have to be focused on Europe. The second interest we have there is that the United States, I think, has prospered for 70 years, as has much of Europe and much of the world, from having a rules-based international order. Well, one of those basic rules is big countries don't use military force to take territory from small countries. That's what Russia's doing. Ukraine did not provoke this war. This is an act of naked Russian aggression. And if the rules-based order really does break down, I believe it's going to be much more difficult in the future for the United States to advance its interests on a range of issues. And the third factor I think we have to ask ourselves is, if Russia wins, if Russia prevails in this, what happens next? Now, my guess is a year ago, most analysts would have said, Russia invade Ukraine, that's not going to happen. But you look at some of the language that Putin has used, and I go back to a conversation he had in June, I believe it was, in St. Petersburg, where he talked about Peter the Great, and Peter the Great conquering the Baltic states. And he said, now, Peter the Great didn't conquer the Baltic states. He was recovering historic Russian lands. Putin looks at most of modern-day Ukraine as historic Russian land. And my concern is that if his ambitions go beyond Ukraine, and you define historic Russian land as anywhere where the flag of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union flew, there's a lot of NATO territory involved there. And in the fight in Ukraine, the United States is spending money and we're spending weapons. If that fight gets to some of those other places, we're spending money, weapons, and the lives of American soldiers. So it's better to stop Putin here in Ukraine. Now, one last comment, I think, as Rose outlined, I mean, there's a balance of interest here. On the one hand, we want to see Ukraine win. We want to see Russia defeated. And I agree with the administration, we also don't want a NATO-Russia war. And so how do you balance those things, which are somewhat in tension? And I think the administration has done a fairly good job of that, although I guess I would come out and say I think they've been a little bit inclined to err too much on the side of caution. I would like to see the United States and the West providing more weapons to Ukraine, because I don't think it's going to be in the West's interest for a long, drawn-out conflict. That's when the question will arise, can we sustain support in the West for Ukraine, as opposed to if we can bring this to a decisive point sooner rather than later. Because it does seem to me that there's something of a contest here, which is as this war goes on, does the impact of the economic sanctions on the Russian economy, but more importantly, the impact of this steady flow of dead Russian soldiers coming home, does that erode Russia's will to fight before economic difficulties and simply running out of arms and ammunition erode Ukraine's ability to fight? And the U.S. and the West have a big say in that because we can keep Ukraine in that game. But I want to do it in circumstances where we can sustain that support because that's important.
Very good. Well, thank you both very much. I'm going to use the chair's prerogative to ask a couple of questions. And already Steve has referred to China, Ambassador. I'm interested, you put your emphasis in a couple places on the consequences of this conflict for the global scene. How do you think about that global scene? Is it all about China? Is it all about Taiwan? Or how are the global consequences as you see them?
Thank you. I certainly see the China part there, and this is something that that most likely keeps most of the people who deal with this problem without any sleep or too little sleep, and that's absolutely a valid point. Just as Mr. Pifer alluded to, we also do believe that if this Russia problem, so to say, and this particular war is being given to Europeans to handle, and the end result of this may also be that Europe lacks the ability and interest to be a truly global partner to the US, not only militarily but also in terms of putting political clout and economic clout behind the US. When it comes to dealing with China challenge. But it's certainly not only limited to China, it's not only limited to Southeast Asia. Just a few months ago I was having a meeting with the Secretary General of the Organization of American States. Mm-hmm. I happen to be accredited also to this fine organization. And without going too many details of our private conversation, I have to tell you that I was struck by his very strong support and attention to the war in Ukraine, and not just because he's a fine man interested in the morally right thing to happen, but also because he pointed out the direct potential consequences to any developments in the Americas. If this conflict ends in a way that justifies aggression.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So definitely the Southern Hemisphere is watching, at least from your experience.
Yeah. And I would certainly not limit it only to Asia and Americas, but this was a very personal and very interesting experience that I had.
Yeah, indeed. I'll just comment very briefly because you mentioned the notion that somehow Europe would be left alone with this war. And I know that has been an anxiety in Europe. When the National Defense Strategy was briefed a couple weeks ago, senior American officials who were briefing it placed an emphasis on the fact that there is a lot of language in the National Defense Strategy of the United States focusing on the role of the Allies and the importance of the Allies, and really asking them to take more responsibility for their own defense. But the emphasis that I heard from these senior officials was also on the fact that the United States is very much present in Europe with 80,000 troops assigned to EUCOM, more certainly than when I was at NATO, and that commitment to reinforcement, should there be any kind of crisis that would require it, is very firm and exercised and trained on a regular basis, as well as with the pre-positioning, of course, of assets in Europe. So I think there is a keen desire to see the burden of Europe's defense resting with the Europeans, but at the same time also a commitment to continued U.S. involvement. That would be my comment.
I do agree with you.
Steve, I wanted to ask you as someone with a lot of experience in Ukraine, and I know you're watching it very, very closely now. How do you see this is a wartime government, right? And they are gripped with that. But how do you see the evolution of Ukrainian governance coming out of this conflict? Let's just look 10 years down the road. We were always concerned that Ukraine was still a country that was in evolution, developing its government, developing its patterns of governance, concern about corruption were abiding. But how do you see it coming out of this conflict? Do you think there will be a maturation that occurs?
One certainly hopes so. No, I mean, I think one of the frustrations among those of us who follow Ukraine is that in the 30 years since it regained independence, it didn't make the progress it could and should have had in terms of economic reforms, in terms of dealing with corruption, and in terms of curbing the oversized political influence of the oligarchs. And that had real costs. I mean, if you look at Poland and Ukraine, in 1990, gross domestic product per capita in Poland and Ukraine was roughly equal. Today in Poland, it's 3 to 4 times that of Ukraine. And that shows the loss that's been Ukraine's faced. And part of that's been, part of that you can understand in political terms. That reform is difficult. It has, political costs sometimes. But I guess what I'm hoping is that after the war, and I think the war will end at some point, and there will be, one thing I can say, I can't say exactly how the war is going to end, but I really very much believe there's going to be a sovereign, independent Ukrainian state on the map of Europe, and it's going to be much larger than that rump state that I believe the Kremlin envisaged on February 24 when they thought they were going to take the eastern half to 2/3 of Ukraine. But you will have Zelensky, if Ukraine prevails, he's going to have power. And it's been interesting to me as watching a pretty fractious Ukrainian political environment come together behind Zelensky when the war began. The question is, politically, can he sustain that?
Right.
And then he could have the ability, if he chooses the right reforms, I think, really to put in place that critical mass that Poland, Estonia, and other countries have done to really unleash the economic potential. And that's going to be really important. I mean, it's not just going to be an economic question, but however this war ends, Ukraine is going to have to maintain a much larger defense, I would argue with Western help. But a stronger economy will allow it to maintain the kind of robust defense it's going to have to do to dissuade the Russians from ever trying something like this again.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you both. I took the chair's prerogative, but do either of you want to hit me with a question before I open the floor up?
If I may actually
Yes.
not ask a question, which I may want to do later, but just add to what Mr. Pifer just said. There's one brand new aspect in this game that Ukrainians never had in the past 30 years that at least may give them additional incentives to deal with this governance part. It's the candidate status of the European Union,
Absolutely, yeah.
which again no one thought would be possible a year ago. But here we are. The Ukrainians are considered the official candidate nation for the European Union, and people who pay attention to the non-military part of Ukrainian activities during this war, including people who work for the European institutions partnering with Ukraine. They say that actually behind all these things happening in the war-fighting domain, where Ukrainians have beaten all the odds, they have been actually moving rapidly ahead on several of these governance issues related to curbing corruption and so on and so forth. I mean, we certainly have to see that how these reforms pan out. We have to see whether the momentum is sustainable. We all understand that every nation emerging from a major military conflict will have their own huge challenges, not only related to the physical destruction of their infrastructure, but also how to recreate the societal cohesion with every member of a society, and how to maintain the societal or political cohesion that has emerged between the opposing political parties during the wartime. But we do believe that the seeds for success are not only there, but they're already sprouting is the word, I guess.
Interesting, and even in the midst of this terrible destruction, that's what the notion of EU membership juxtaposed against the amount of reconstruction they'll have to undertake and the hits to the Ukrainian economy, but that's a very, very encouraging message. Steve, go ahead.
I'd like to just tag on 2 comments. One is, I think one thing Ukraine will also emerge from this war is a really coalesced and strong sense of national identity, of which being Europe is part of it.
Right.
And a national identity that I think was beginning to form after 2014, but for the first 15, 20 years of Ukraine's independence after 1991 really wasn't there. So that's one factor. The other factor, this is something a Ukrainian friend shared, and he said, think about it. He said, it actually may be easier to come to terms with corruption and the oligarchs, many of whom have seen their wealth dramatically reduced. I mean, Renat Akhmetov, who a year ago was the probably richest oligarch in Ukraine, well, his number 1 asset was the Azov steel mill in Mariupol,
Right.
which the Russians spent 3 years reduced, or 3 months
Pulverizing,
reduced.
yeah.
And so the question is, with their reduced resources now, maybe that makes them less of a factor, and that may make it easier for the government to rein in there. And again, they have a place to play as business people, but not with the sort of outsized political influence that oligarchs have exerted in Ukraine over the past 30 years.
Very interesting. Thank you. Well, let me open it up for questions or comments from the floor.
My name is Vidas Mickevičius. I'm Lithuanian American, and Ukrainian question is pretty close to my, country of origin. I have a question to Mr. Pifer. You mentioned that if European stability will be much better if Ukraine wins war, and European stability would be damaged if Russia wins this war. So how do you imagine that if Ukraine wins war, what happens to Russia? Because Russia will remain. It's not going to be divided into pieces or whatever. And after the Second World War, we had occupational forces standing there for quite some time and doing denazification. What's going to happen to Russia?
Yeah. I guess I would define victory as either the Ukrainian military drives the Russian military out of Ukraine, which I hope will happen. I'm not sure that will happen. So or at least we get to a point where Ukrainian progress on the battlefield brings the Russians to a point where there's a negotiation that produces a settlement on terms that Kyiv can accept. And that should be the business of the Ukrainians to make that decision, what they can and cannot live with. So I don't think you're talking about a long-term occupation of Russian territory. My view is I don't think the Ukrainian army is going to march on Moscow. Their focus is to get the Russian army out of Ukraine. But what I do believe is however the war ends, Ukraine is going to have assistance from the West. It's going to have a very robust military, a modernized military. And I think that's their best security guarantee is having a military that is seen by the Russians as so effective that Moscow would say, look how hard it was in 2022 when we'd been spending 10 to 15 times as much per year as the Ukrainians had, when we had 5 times as many tanks, our military was modernized, and look how hard it was. But then if they have a more modernized military, and I'm talking about things like Leopard tanks, M1 tanks, maybe F-16s, we got to help the Ukrainians get to a spot where in Moscow they just see this as too hard. They've got to figure something else out.
Could I ask you, Ambassador, obviously you're a neighbor of Russia and have many Russian-speaking people on your territory, and I know Russia is very much seen as a threat, but what about Russian defeat, and how do you think about Russia after that defeat from an Estonian perspective?
From the Estonian perspective, I mean, we've been living next to Russia since the ages, right? So we
know they won't go away.
And they won't go away.
Geography is pretty fixed there.
It is. Our experience has been that Russia has been the most dangerous to its neighbors when it's the strongest. When they feel politically and militarily, economically confident, they develop violent ideas and ideas that really spell doom to its neighbors, and again. We believe very strongly that what we are facing right now in 2022, in a way, is comparable to 1939. That this is a 1939 moment for us. If the West would have been able to stop Hitler in his tracks in 1939, then most likely these tragedies that came after that would not have happened. And we do believe that we have to stop Putin now. Otherwise, we are in for a long period of further troubles.
I have a question to Ambassador Prikk.
And please identify yourself.
My name is Rago Vetik. I'm professor of Mr. Prikk 20 years ago. Now, currently I'm at Stanford, visiting scholar, but my base is Tallinn University. My question is as follows. One of the arguments Russian government and Putin makes is that they feel threatened by closeness of NATO, by expansion of NATO. So, how you would comment that statement from Russian government?
Thank you, Professor Vetik. I do remember very well the first in the first lecture that I attended with you on the podium, and described to my colleagues today the feeling that I had after that we have one truly Western style professor that I truly liked as a professor. So thank you for that experience. Not only 20, but close to 30 years ago.
Are you surprised to see him here at Stanford, or you knew he was here?
I found it out only today. So up until yesterday, I didn't know that. I mean, it's easy and hard to argue with that. Firstly. Even in your question, there was a reference to Russian argument that they feel threatened by NATO expansion. Now, expansion refers to something that happens without any agency or any participation of those that are subject to this enlargement, which certainly has not been the case. Not even 1% truth there. There is no single country that has become the member of NATO because NATO imposed the membership on those countries, but all the enlargements of NATO have been taking place because these countries have felt the need. These countries have felt the deficit in security in the region where they are. The same happened now with Sweden and Finland. They are not joining NATO because they have now figured out that this is a fun club to be at. They are not joining NATO because they feel that they have a security surplus that they are willing to offer to NATO, but rather they felt the deficit there. At the same time, and of course, Mrs. Gottemoeller, you are so much better than me, and Mr. Pifer, you too, but with your NATO experience, to bring all those examples of different assurances, of different attempts to reach out to NATO, to Russia, that NATO has gone through during the past 30 years or so, in order to assure them that to give them transparency and give different assurances to make sure that Russia does not feel in any way threatened by that. Even when we look at the capability development of NATO. When we look at the steps that the countries in Europe and also US and Canada have taken over the past 30 years in maintaining or developing their military capabilities, it's very easy to understand that the focus has never been in peer-to-peer conflict with the country to the east of us. So the facts speak very clearly that Russia may use this argument, and I may even think of different Russian politicians or academics who may not have all the data and who may believe in this. But there is no truth in this perception.
Yeah. I'll ask perhaps Steve to comment if you wish, because he was very active in the diplomacy of trying to work between NATO and Russia. But I like to recollect that it was Vladimir Putin himself who came to the Rome summit in 2002 and signed the Rome Declaration that established the NATO-Russia Council and established a very wide-ranging agenda of cooperative projects between NATO and Russia that for the next 12 years, practically up to 2014, were very, I thought, practical in producing results. For example, halting the flow of heroin out of Afghanistan. There was a NATO-Russia project, very successful in that regard, working to set up common airspace and better air traffic control over European and Russian skies. So from my perspective, there was a really hard-working, pragmatic effort to try to develop a decent working relationship with Russia and to be reassuring that NATO is a defensive alliance and not bent on marching into Russia and waging war in order to take them over in an imperial sense. It's all of this is nonsense. It's coming out of the Kremlin these days, that NATO is a threat to Russia. But I really like to recollect that it was Vladimir Putin himself who signed the Rome Declaration, and somehow things went wrong after that. But Steve, do you wish to comment?
Yeah, well, I would just comment that when Putin signed the Rome Declaration in May of 2002, in which they pledged to deepen NATO-Russia relations, to give it a new character, a new quality, he did that knowing full well that there was going to be a second NATO summit in November of that year, at which NATO was going to invite new members to join, and it most likely would include the Baltic states. So he had no problem with enlargement then, which was going to bring 3 new countries to Russian borders or the borders of the Kaliningrad. That wasn't a problem. When he was asked in May about what about Sweden and Finland, he said, well, not a big deal. When Finland joins NATO, I said I think it will happen formally early next year, you're going to more than double the border between Russian territory and NATO territory. So I think Putin trots NATO enlargement out as an excuse. But as Rose said, I mean, NATO, and as the ambassador said, I mean, NATO's made some real efforts in the last 25 years to try to be accommodating towards Russia. I mean, back in 1997, NATO said that there was no requirement for the deployment of substantial combat forces on the territory of new member states. And correct me if I'm wrong, but up until 2014, there was virtually no great NATO ground presence in the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, any of those countries. That only changed in 2014 after Russia seized Crimea and got involved in the fighting in Donbass.
And even then, the NATO allied presence on the territory of our countries was limited to battalion-size battle groups, which were below the commonly agreed threshold of substantial combat forces, which at least brigade or division side would be. And I think actions certainly speak louder than words, also in the sense what Russia himself does and how they prepare for this alleged NATO's aggression. Mm-hmm. So what we've seen is that throughout this stage of the war in Ukraine, they have been deprioritizing the border with NATO.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
It's the basis behind our immediate border are not unmanned, but
Lightly manned.
lightly manned or manned below the normal thresholds. So they clearly don't feel any practical threat to their own western border from NATO.
That's
right now.
fascinating.
And that's even though Russian officials and the Russian television pundits, they portray this as Russia is at war with NATO.
Right.
Now, one of the things in lots of years of dealing with Russia, you have to take account of there's a certain Russian ego. And I think that there's been this decision to portray that because the Russian ego has a hard time saying, well, we're losing just to Ukraine. Mm-hmm. It's much better to be seen as we're losing to Ukraine and NATO in the West.
Right. Who are ganging up on us.
Yes.
Mr. Ambassador, I'm Todd Stewart, a retired Foreign Service officer. Mr. Ambassador, Estonia has a significant Russian-speaking population, and I imagine that they do have access to Russian television. I'm curious to know how much sympathy for the Russian position exists among these people.
Thank you for the question. The picture is mixed. Firstly, what I would like to point out is that that even among this group of people that often is referred to as Russian speakers or Russian-speaking community in Estonia, it's not completely homogeneous in terms of their own ethnic background. So even though quite often in their own statements the Russian leadership would like to claim them all as theirs, so to say. I mean, both in terms of ethnic background as well as their legal status in Estonia, whether they are Estonian citizens, whether they are Russian citizens, or they happen to be Ukrainian, Belarus, or some other country's citizens. There's a lot of variety there. The same applies to their attitudes and perceptions regarding this war. We see that more and more the younger generation is not really falling for not really believing the Russian public narrative. The younger generation is much more integrated into, let's say, Estonian-speaking community, and they really benefit from all the different features of Estonian and European modern society. With older generation, it's slightly different, but then again, we witnessed that when the 24th of February really happened, there was let's say, jolt of shock going through the Russian-speaking community, because many of them did share the view, not all of them, but many of them did share the view that Putin has been exploiting that as if the Ukrainians are just part of the Russians or Russian world. But they didn't believe the part that therefore Russia should go to war against the Ukrainians. So they faced a situation where part of their own worldview kind of collapsed, and we also saw this as a point where more of the Russian-speaking community in Estonia switched to the Estonian news sources. From the Russian sources. Of course, there are different. There are more layers and more colors than I'm able to describe right now, and I know that Professor Vetik has studied these issues very deeply, so he's much better prepared to go through all kinds of layers. But I would leave it here.
There is as I understand, an Estonian news source, or more than one, perhaps that is Russian language in nature.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, of course, like in any free society, if there is demand for certain news sources and news, then there's also a supply for them. So there are many private channels or private companies providing the radio programming, the digital content, and so on and so forth. But also our national public broadcasting has both Russian radio program as well as the TV program, and we've seen that two of the crises, the pandemic and this stage of the war, have both increased the viewership and the number of listeners of these programs among the Estonian Russian speakers.
Thank you. Professor Prikk, can I put you on the spot? Would you like to comment on this at all?
Yes. Thank you, because we are doing research on that, what the Ambassador just mentioned. We have been doing so-called integration monitorings in Estonia since the year 2000. And there is interesting fact on 2015. We altogether, and it is every second, third year, and we had survey 2015. And if you compare data of 2015 to the previous one, 2011, you saw that even this Maidan thing had impact on Estonian Russians. And in this context, I totally agree to Ambassador Prikk that the war in Ukraine is awful, but it is good for Estonian internal integration.
And one more thing, if I may.
Thank you.
It's very important that that the community in Estonia who speaks fluent Russian or who may prefer to speak Russian as the first language has considerably increased now during and due to the war. Estonia, the country of only 1.3 million people, we have received in excess of 60,000 refugees who have told our authorities that they intend to stay in Estonia. So this is close to 5% of our population that has increased during this past couple of months. In comparison, in the US, that would be around 50 million new residents. Only 4 states have more people in the US than 50 million. So this in itself actually certainly creates new kind of issues, and it's not been easy for our society to make sure that every person has their shelter and healthcare and education and everything. But we've been very successful in that. But it certainly has created, and I believe will further create changes in the dynamics among the Estonian community that can speak Russian or prefers to speak Russian as a first language.
Yeah, that's remarkable. I hadn't realized that such an enormous percentage of your total population. I think we have time for one more question. Is there a question from the hall? Yes, please, right here.
Michael Keller, Stanford. Taking a look at all the difficulties that Russia has had, its troops not being very well prepared, are they really sending their best troops to Ukraine or just cannon fodder? Imagining what happens to a country when much of its young people, many of its young people who are educated, depart instantly and then continuously elsewhere because they can't stand what's happening in their country and they don't want to be mobilized. On top of that, you see the Finland and Sweden becoming perhaps NATO members pretty soon. Then you have these, in addition to all the military difficulties and the defeats, really, that the Ukrainian military has perpetrated on them. In the last few days, we've seen 3 tiny attacks, perhaps by drone, perhaps by people from Ukraine. But are they just enough to start putting the inflection on this whole thing that Russia really doesn't know what it's doing and really needs to rethink what it's up to? it's like an overwhelming tide of big actions, military defeats, NATO getting larger, and then these little tiny pinpricks and the population of Russian intelligentsia, young people who are the next generation, leaving. When do the Russian nomenclatura, as it were, realize that they're in trouble?
It's an excellent question. I think they already realize they're in trouble, but whether they're willing to act on that realization. But this is a great question to end our session on. So, Steve, why don't I start with you?
Yeah, however this war ends, I think Russia emerges greatly diminished. Military casualties, 100,000 estimated so far. They have lost huge amounts of equipment. It will take their defense budget many years easily to replace the equipment that they've lost, had captured, or expended in Ukraine. Economically, okay, the OECD projection is the Russian economy contracts by 3.9% this year and by 5.6% next year. Because they're cut off now from Western high-tech imports. There was a very interesting story in the New York Times on Monday about Volkswagen and what's happened there, that they've now ceased operations because 60 to 70% of their parts were imported. They can't get those parts now. And I think there was a statistic that said if you looked at Russian automobile production from March until September, it had declined by 80%. So there are huge things happening in the economy. More than 1,000 large companies from the West have left Russia, including companies that weren't sanctioned. There's no sanction on McDonald's or IKEA, but they concluded that in the current circumstances, doing business as usual in Russia contained too much reputational risk. So economically, geopolitically, Finland and Sweden, I mean, the Baltic Sea is going to become virtually a NATO lake. So I look at this, it's a tragedy for Ukraine, but it's also a disaster for Russia. And the question to my mind is, at what point do people in Russia begin to understand the magnitude of that disaster? And then is there some way that they can begin to adopt another course and change the policy? And I'm not sure I'm smart enough about, I think there are a small prospect that if the public begins to turn against it, one thing I've always found interesting is for the autocratic system that Putin has built in Russia, they pay a lot of attention to public sentiment. They do a lot of polling. If the public begins to turn, does that then cause the Kremlin to look for a way out? Or in the inner circle, and again, I don't think it's a high probability, but I think it's not zero. Do people in the inner circle decide that this is Putin's war and it's time to find a new course and maybe send Putin down to his large palace on the Black Sea coast into retirement?
Ambassador, how do you see that question?
It's a fascinating topic, and I'm certainly not able to go through all the layers that are there, but the entire reign of Vladimir Putin has been about this kind of societal contract whereby the Russian people have been told to kind of be demobilized or not stick their noses into the things of the government or the state, and now there is the situation where we see signs where this state-run media is trying to mobilize people to be interested, concerned, and participating in whatever objectives the higher leadership has set. Up until this point, and particularly up until this mobilization was called, we saw very clearly that the war was a matter of them, for the elite of Russians, the people living particularly in St. Petersburg and Moscow. It was about them fighting there, but still not affecting their life and lifestyle that much. For that reason, for example, Putin very early approved the so-called parallel import of Western consumer goods and luxury items, to make sure that these people who are used to using the newest iPhone, not just some other brand smartphone, that they still can continue pretty much with the lifestyle. Now, the first mobilization rattled a bit the Russian society, but did not change anything yet. We don't know what's going to happen next year. There are rumors of next wave of mobilization happening sometime early in winter. This may be risky. But then what we've seen is that those people who have fled Russia after this mobilization was called. I mean, before that there were people with more genuine political reasons. But those people who fled Russia when mobilization was called, they most certainly did oppose being mobilized themselves. They more likely than not opposed mobilization as such, but for the most part they didn't have the problem with war being waged against Ukraine. So you haven't seen any mass protests of Russians against the war taking place somewhere abroad where they have fled allegedly for opposing the war. They certainly oppose being drafted themselves. But with the authoritarian societies, the tricky thing is that even with all this secret polling going on, and we certainly know that Kremlin is very keenly paying attention to any signs of unrest, trying to manage it in one way or another. With the authoritarian societies, the problem is, both for outsiders who try to assess what's going on, but certainly also for the regime, that since there are no natural, let's say, natural valves to release the pressure, so to say, you never know what's going to trigger, like the mass event that may suddenly change the course of history. And certainly this is something that the Russian regime is very much concerned of. And I suspect that we may not understand that something actually triggers a mass change in this whole regime also before it's already there.
Right. I don't have anything to add really, except to say that I think this has been a really thorough and excellent discussion today. I thank you all for your very good questions and comments throughout. Professor, thank you for your additional engagement in our discussion, and please join me in thanking Ambassador Prikk and Mr. Pifer.